One of the most important aspects of becoming a better programmer is learning how to build those projects much quicker. And I want to show you a few different ways to do this. So one of the first things to do is to learn how to use your IDE much more efficiently. So for example, this is just some demo code I have, and it has a fetch data function and a clear cache function down here. And you can see we're getting some data from the cache, and we call it temp data here. And oftentimes when I'm coding, I do this thing where I sort of use these not great variable names and then realize I should probably fix those down the line to make my code just more clean and readable and all of that. So how exactly can I do this? Well, there's a few simple ways to do it where we can just go find all of these occurrences. You could do something like find and replace. So Command F, and then I could type in here, say temp data, and then I could do some find and replace like this. But there's also another way to do this where you don't have to do any of that, and that's going to be Command Shift L in my IDE. And what that's going to do here, at least in VS Code, is give me a cursor at every instance of this variable. So I could get rid of this and maybe have this be cached data like this, and that would be a better variable name. Now, there also might be some instance where maybe all I want to do is change them within this function. I don't want to be changing them in the clear cache function. So I'm going to undo this, and instead of creating all of these different instances of these cursors, I can do Command D, and that's going to create a new cursor at the next instance. I can just keep doing this till I get to the bottom of the fetch data function, and then again I could change this to cached data if I wanted to change it in just this function. And really the point is not specifically about the multi-cursor editing in VS Code, although it is great and I highly recommend you use it. It's more about the idea of finding different ways to use your IDE more efficiently, because there are tons of tools built into them to make them incredibly useful, and a lot of them just don't end up being used all that often, even though they can save you a ton of coding time. Another way to save a lot of time when you're building projects is to avoid reinventing the wheel. And what I mean by this is mostly just leverage open source projects and things like this that can allow you to not build things that are already built. There's no point in building something that already exists. Most of the time, we can just use the tools that are already out there, and then you can focus your actual coding time on building novel things. So working on the things that are actually new about your project, rather than spending a lot of time implementing something that somebody else has already implemented, and you can just use that implementation. Now, of course, there's a time and a place for this reinventing the wheel. For example, if you're at a massive tech company, oftentimes they don't want you to be introducing a lot of extra dependencies into the code base, because that's sort of more potential errors. That's more code that they did not write and that they have to worry about potentially having some bug in it. And it also could limit the customization down the line. So sometimes at these big companies, they do want to sort of do everything in-house. But if you're working on a small project or even at a smaller sized company, the biggest priority should be actually building the novel features and doing those things as quickly as possible. And I think generally speaking, the better way to do that is to avoid reinventing the wheel and to use these open source tools. And another way to avoid reinventing the wheel is to leverage APIs and other out-of-the-box solutions where it's possible. For example, most applications, or at least a lot of applications, require some sort of login. And this feels like it should be a very simple part of an application. And from a user perspective, they don't even really care that much about it as long as it's secure, private, and all of that. However, it's actually a pretty difficult thing to build, and it can take a lot of time to get right. And then you could still end up with some bugs in that login code. So because of that, I would highly recommend you use a tool like today's sponsor, Auth0. So they actually allow you to go all the way to production with their free plan, and it's going to support way more than the vast majority of projects even need. So for most projects, it's going to be completely free. So this is going to support up to 25,000 monthly active users. It's going to support things like social login with Google and Facebook. It's going to support custom domains. It's going to have a ton of security features baked into it that frankly are going to be much more advanced than any security that I could write myself, and likely that you could do on your own as well. And what's even better is how much time you'll actually save. It's not an exaggeration to say that you could get a simple authentication running in like 5 minutes, and all of the different features they have are also very easy to integrate. For example, these are the Quickstart guides on their documentation, and I think they're very good and detailed. So we can select what type of application we're making, for example, a React application, but there's tons of options, and we can see exactly step by step how to add authentication to our React application. You'll see it actually gives us all of the different code we need. So this is our index.js, and all we do is add this provider, and then we have our login.js, which is simply a login button that when you click it, it calls this login with redirect, which comes from a hook they provide. Then we have logout, which works basically the same way. We have a logout button, which calls logout from this use auth0 hook. Then we have our profile page where we can get the current user if we are authenticated and if it is loading, again, from use auth0. So it's all just very, very simple to use within the React ecosystem. This tends to be true no matter what different frameworks and libraries you are using to build your own application. I already mentioned about how to use your IDE more efficiently, but another thing that I think you can be doing within your IDE is to utilize snippets and templates. So essentially what this does is it allows you to say, hey, this is code I write a lot. So I want to make sure I'm just doing it the same way every time and doing it automatically instead of typing it all out. For example, here we're in VS Code again, and I have a component called myComponent.tsx that I need to create. So it's going to be a React component. And of course, I could just manually type this out, but that's going to take some time and it's going to be inconsistent because there's so many different ways to create a React component. I want them to be the same in all of my components within my project. So the way I've done this is I've made a snippet. So I'm going to do RFC for React functional component, click enter, and this is the functional component I use in all of my code bases. So it has stylex.create. So this is what I use for styling in a lot of my projects. So it's going to add that automatically for me. It's also going to have my component, which you can see is named the same thing as the file. And then it's going to add stylex to this hello world here. And if I did actually need props, I can do React functional component props. So add a P here. You can see it also adds a type for my component props right here. So it also adds the props and it destructures them for me as well. It's not just about creating React components. I have tons of these snippets that I've created that make coding much, much more efficient. So if you find yourself doing the same thing over and over again, make a snippet for it and it's going to make your coding just much more efficient. Another way to save a lot of time is to automate repetitive tasks. So write custom scripts to do things that you are doing a lot. Sometimes this is sort of steps around testing and deployment and code compilation, but oftentimes it can be completely different things. So just whatever it is that you find yourself doing a lot that's very repetitive, doesn't take a lot of brain power, it just sort of takes time, see if you can automate that task away. Now, that said, there's a caveat here, and that's that the value of automating a repetitive task is going to be proportional to how often that repetitive task is being done. And oftentimes at like big tech companies, there's a lot of value in this because there's a lot of people who are likely doing the same repetitive tasks, and they can all sort of share these scripts. But if you're building some project on your own, oftentimes the process of making the automation is going to take more time than just doing the task yourself, even if you don't really want to be doing it manually. So just be careful and try not to over automate. So try not to automate things where it's going to take more time to do the automation than it would be to just do the task itself. Another super important coding skill that oftentimes goes a little bit overlooked, or some people just don't develop as much as they should, is learning how to use the command line. For example, here I have this repository that I made for another video for a Tetris game in React. Let's say I want to update the score. So I want to figure out where exactly the score is in the code. Do you know how to do that in the command line? Well, you can actually use grep. Then I'm going to do -rnw and then whatever I want to look for. So in this case, let's look for score and a dot to say the current directory, so where we currently are. So what this is actually doing is grep is searching through the code base, -r is recursive, meaning it's going to look through all of these subdirectories and all of the different files. In is going to give us new lines, so we can see the actual line numbers where this code is, and w is going to match whole words, which actually isn't going to matter in this case, but it's sort of just naturally what I always do. And you can see, okay, here are the different places where the score is actually mentioned. We have this use Tetris hook in 2 different places and app.tsx. And if I wanted to see some more context, I could go back up and do this again, but add in -c for context and maybe a 3, and that's going to add 3 lines of context before and after all of these. So essentially we can just see more context, which can be useful from time to time. And of course, this isn't just about learn how to use grep. It's about learn how to use all of the different tools available to you within the terminal, as they can actually be very useful in becoming a more effective programmer. We talked about using the command line efficiently, but within the command line, I think there's actually one tool in specific that is very important to learn at a deeper level, but most developers don't actually really do that. And that's going to be Git or whatever version control system you're using. So of course, it's important to learn the basics of how to clone a repository. So essentially how to download the code and then how to make some commit. So how to add some code to that repository and probably how to make a pull request. So how to request that your changes are added to the repository if you're working with multiple people. But there's so much more to learn about Git than just this. For example, learning about branching more in depth so that you can work on multiple features at the same time without worrying about them sort of conflicting with each other. You should also learn things like the best ways to resolve merge conflicts, or things like how to figure out where some code actually came from. So to find the Git blame claim to figure out who actually added some code. So if you have some question about some code, you can go back to the pull request where it was actually created. If you're anything like me, you also will be making a lot of mistakes. And because of that, it's important to understand how to sort of roll back changes and what the different ways to do that are and what the sort of trade-offs between them are. And beyond that, there's so much more to Git. So I just highly recommend you learn it more in depth. And if you do want me to make a video on Git in depth, that's something I've thought about doing on this channel. So do let me know if that's something you're interested in, and maybe I'll do that in the future. One thing I used to do a lot as a beginner, as an intern and things like this, is I documented every single thing I did. Now, this doesn't mean public documentation. I wasn't adding a ton to my team's documentation, although that's also something you should be doing. But what I was doing was I was documenting all of the things I was learning. Every time I looked something up, I wrote it down. Every time I learned something new, whether it be from looking it up or from talking to somebody on my team or just sort of figuring it out on my own, I wrote that thing down. What this did for me is, one, the process of writing it down, I think, helps you sort of retain that information, but also it gave me a place to go back and find the things that I've already looked up. So I don't have to go through the process of finding that information online again, because oftentimes you do need the same information multiple times and you've just already looked it up before. And what I found was that over time, I was able to build up a pretty robust documentation of the things that I was oftentimes looking up, but then I was also able to become less and less reliant on that documentation over time, which was super helpful. Another thing that I've been doing more and more in my own development process, and it's saving me a ton of time, is actually utilizing AI. And I know that might be a bit surprising coming from me because I have had some negative opinions in the past about some AI tools, but I'm actually not really using it to do the coding job for me. I don't have AI write very much code. But what I do use it for, and where I find it very helpful, is one, sort of for learning. So I ask it questions and it can teach me about new things. I use it sort of as a way for idea generation. So it's just another person almost to bounce ideas off of. I use it to verify my own ideas. So I say, hey, this is a system I'm building and this is sort of the design I've come up with. Do you see any problems here? Do you see anything that could come up? And oftentimes it says something that's sort of nonsensical, but sometimes it does have actually good feedback for me. I also use it for things like repetitive tasks. So we talked about automating repetitive tasks, but sometimes you can also just use AI for those repetitive tasks. So you can go to ChatGPT and say, hey, I have this function. I would like you to write some test cases for it. And there's also a ton of other AI code editor tools that can do that for you. But the point being, you can go to some AI and you can say, hey, generate some test cases for me, or do whatever the repetitive task is. And oftentimes AI is very good at that. And specifically, one of my favorite prompts to use will be to go to ChatGPT and say, here's a thing I've done. What are the alternatives? So it's not even asking a question in the sense of, is this good? It's saying, hey, give me other ways to do this. That way it's sort of basing its thought process, if that's the word you want to use, on finding these alternatives. And oftentimes those alternatives will be a worse solution, but that to me sort of verifies I probably have one of the better solutions. But sometimes it comes up with some alternative that is actually better. And beyond learning to code more efficiently, you also might be wondering if it's even worth it to learn to code at all anymore. So if you're curious about my thoughts on this, here's a video you should watch next on my thoughts on the whole tech job market right now. And again, big thank you to Auth0 for sponsoring this video. If you do want to give it a try, there'll be a link at the top of the description.